Hydroxychloroquine's back in the news, and I know there are lots of questions and uncertainty with different views that are circulating, so I thought I'd try to offer a few points about the data that might help give some clarity. Let's start with the fact that there are a number of doctors who have said they've successfully treated patients with hydroxychloroquine. One physician got lots of attention just this week by claiming she's treated around 350 patients and all recovered. And she's not the only one with similar outcomes. At the same time, the scientific community and medical community have broadly discouraged hydroxychloroquine's use in treating COVID-19, saying there's no evidence that it's effective. So it's certainly understandable that you might be finding it hard to reconcile these different pieces of information, but we'll try to make some progress here. Let's first think kind of broadly about science and how it works. One way to think about how scientific understandings are built is kind of analogous to how a jury should come to a verdict in a trial. If someone's charged with a crime, they're presumed innocent unless the evidence presented convinces the jury beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty. Only then would they be convicted. When we work with data, we have a concept called the null. I talked about it some in a separate video that you can check out later if you're interested, but one way to think about the null is that it's kind of science's presumption of innocence, or in science terms, it's a presumption that the variable you're testing has no effect on some outcome. For example, a medicine being tested has no effect on a disease. This scientific presumption of no effect remains intact unless data to the contrary are offered that are sufficiently convincing, or to put it in legal terms, may be convincing beyond reasonable doubt. Now, with that in mind, let's consider the reports from these doctors and think about whether they meet such a bar. Let's first take a hypothetical scenario where, without treatment, an average of 1% of people who get some virus die and 99% recover. This doesn't necessarily reflect the rate for COVID-19, but it's probably at least in the ballpark, and if anything, it might be a little high, and so conservative for our purpose. Now, imagine a doctor sees 200 patients with the virus. Here, I have a series of vertical white bars. There are 200 side by side, and they'll represent the 200 patients. I'll let my computer randomly assign whether each dies or not, using that probability of 1%. Now, 1% of 200 is 2, so that's the expectation. But since this is a random sample, there's no guarantee that exactly 2 will die. It's the same idea of flipping a coin 200 times. We expect 100 heads and 100 tails, but 103 and 97 wouldn't be at all surprising. Now, I'll represent deaths with a red bar. In this specific trial, 2 died. Then I do it again for another 200 patients. Say 200 that visited a different doctor's office. In this case, 3 died. I do this 20 times, giving us hypothetical data for 200 times 20, or 4,000 patients. If you count all the deaths, there are 39 here, and dividing by 4,000, that gives us 0.975%, which is right around our expected 1% average. However, there's obviously variability when considering one group at a time. In this case, the largest number was 5, and for 3 groups, nobody died. Remember, this is with no treatment. It's the baseline expectation, and therefore, it could represent that null expectation if we were testing some drug's effects. This represents one line of reasoning for why those reports by individual doctors on successes with hydroxychloroquine aren't widely considered to be convincing pieces of evidence to support benefits of the drug. If there are a number of doctors each treating hundreds of patients with hydroxychloroquine, we'd fully expect some of those doctors would get a 100% success or survival rate just by chance, even if the drug has absolutely no effect. In other words, that's not all that surprising under the null in this case. An added factor is that in the context of something like social media, we're more likely to actually hear about these, and we have no idea how many of these are out there because they simply don't get reported. So, that's one, but not the only reason for caution when drawing conclusions from these reports. There's also a potential bias here related to the patients represented in these data. I think most, if not all of these reports, have come from family or primary care physicians, or at least doctors in similar types of practices. As such, it's at least reasonable to think that who they're treating may not be a random sample of COVID-19 patients, since those with more severe symptoms, and who are therefore more likely to have a bad outcome, are probably more likely to be treated in a hospital or an emergency room, and not by a primary care physician. This isn't the fault of any of those doctors. What patients come to them isn't in their control, but it is something that has to be considered if you're going to deal with the data in a responsible way. These are just a couple examples of reasons why so much effort goes into planning and designing actual scientific studies. These types of things are common issues, and it's important that, to whatever degree possible, studies are designed in ways that control and account for them. So, speaking of studies that are more carefully designed, there are a number of those out there too. As a general summary, at least from my reading, there actually is some reasonably good evidence that hydroxychloroquine can reduce COVID-19 in vitro. That means in studies where you might grow some cells in, for example, a petri dish or a test tube, and then infect those cells with a virus and see if the treatment's effective. Unfortunately, it's a big step from the petri dish to the human body, and results don't always translate. As an example, a study in 2006 actually showed pretty clear benefits of hydroxychloroquine for inhibiting influenza virus in vitro. This result led to a subsequent clinical study on hydroxychloroquine in influenza, where effects were evaluated in people in a relatively large and well-designed study, and in that one, no positive effects of hydroxychloroquine were observed. There really just isn't much convincing evidence out there at this point that hydroxychloroquine has beneficial effects for COVID-19. Certainly not enough to put it in that beyond some reasonable doubt category, where we might be able to reject the null. In contrast, there are several studies that, given their design, should have had fairly good power to detect effects, but the effects weren't seen. Now, this doesn't mean that science is done with hydroxychloroquine. I just did a search for clinical trials, either planned or in progress, related to hydroxychloroquine and COVID-19, and there are nearly 250 of them around the world, and many here in the US. Results from any of these absolutely have the potential to change the views of scientists and medical professionals alike. That possibility, for any understanding in science to be changed by new evidence, is a hallmark of science, and as a result, we can consider every conclusion and understanding in science to be to some degree tentative. But such a change will only happen if the data are sufficient to convince that jury of the scientific, and in this case, medical community. Hope that maybe provides a little more clarity. If it's helpful, please do like and share, and feel free to subscribe to the channel for similar videos.